Hello everyone, welcome welcome back to my channel. My name is Hannah if you're new here, and in today's video I'm going to be giving you some adult fantasy and science fiction recommendations for primarily young adult readers. When I was transitioning from being a primarily young adult fantasy reader to an adult fantasy reader, I was looking for this exact video. I think I was exposed to some fantasy that wasn't very transitional, that didn't do me any favors when I was transitioning from young adult to adult. For example, I basically went from reading, fun, lighthearted young adult fantasy to reading the Broken Earth trilogy. And that was my first foray into adult fantasy. And while fabulous and hard-hitting and wonderful as the fifth season is and that whole trilogy, I don't know if it's necessarily the most easy to digest in terms of its style and execution and its writing, but it was just a very abrupt tonal shift from young adult to adult. There's definitely something to be said about the tone of young adult books versus the tone of adult books, and how serious and sometimes intense they can be in terms of the stakes, the world building, and the plots. All that caveat out of the way, I've got 10 books and series to talk about, so let's get into my recommendations. The first one I'm going to be talking about is the Rook and Rose trilogy by M.A. Carrick. The first is The Mask of Mirrors. Now, this is primarily a con story. This is about Ren, who is a con artist, and she is attempting to portray herself as this young, distant cousin of this wealthy noble family to try and get in their good graces and con them out of a lot of money. But little does she know that this family she's trying to infiltrate is going bankrupt, and they're very suspicious. So this is primarily a con story, but then it opens up into a large political and fantastical drama. The reason I think this series is so young adult appropriate, despite being an adult story, is the tone. The tone of this series is truly comforting, and it's in sharp contrast to dark fantasy, I'll say. You kind of know through the tone of this book that everything's going to be okay in the end, and everyone's going to be okay. Not that the stakes aren't high, because the stakes are high in this series, but the tone of this work really lends itself well to a young adult reader who's maybe looking for something that's comforting, comfortable, feels a little like a safe choice. Everything's going to be okay. Also, on top of that, this story is just incredible, and there's also a great side subplot romance in here as well that I think young adult readers would really enjoy. Then we have the Devabad trilogy, the first being The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This is again about a con woman who accidentally, for real, summons a djinn while she's trying to con a group of people and gets swept away to the djinn capital. We're also following a prince of the djinn in the capital, and so it's a dual perspective. And this is fabulous because it leans heavily on the politics of the djinn world. The world building is excellent. There's also some incredible angst and tension in terms of the characters and the romance in here. I think this is the most young adult in terms of its romantic tension and angst that I have a hard time finding adult books with this level of angst. That's something that I miss about primarily reading young adult, is all the angst and the longing and the kind of the over-the-top emotions about things sometimes. It's juicy, it's fun, and I think the Devabad trilogy has that level of drama and angst young adult readers might appreciate while still being in an adult fantasy package, if that makes sense. Next is Foundry Side, or the Founders Trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is about a thief who is tasked with stealing an object, and she is on the mission and decides to keep the object for herself, and a whole political scheme unfolds. This is a wild ride. This one might be a little bit more of a challenge to get into for a young adult reader, specifically for the magic system. The magic system in here is like magical coding, rewriting the codes of objects to do things that they're not supposed to, is a little complicated and confusing, but I think this plot in the Foundry Side and the trilogy is so fast-paced and exciting and fun that I think if you're looking to stretch your fantasy wings in an adult capacity, I do think this series is worth a pickup for young adult readers. Sansia, who's our main character, is young but not a child, so that might also appeal to younger audiences. There's a cute like budding romance in this first one, and this almost reads like a movie script. I think that's a positive. Some people might not enjoy that aspect of this book, but I really enjoy that about the Founders Trilogy, is how fast-paced it is. Then we have one of my favorites on this list, which is Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri. I love this one because it's kind of a forced arranged marriage where our main character is a secret magic user and she gets found out, and the magic police, they're not exactly police, they're like a priesthood that enforces no magic, and so they basically capture her and force her to marry one of their acolytes, and this is a slow burn romance between the two of them, as well as being a fantasy story. I absolutely adore this book. Again, it's the angst and tension of the romance that I think truly leads this one forward in terms of why I think it would be a great young adult pickup. The world building is interesting, fascinating, but not hard to glom onto, and the romance is to die for in here. I think this is, again, along with the Daevabad trilogy, this is the one that feels the most like a young adult fantasy in terms of the romance, the angst and tension. I truly love this one, and it is a duology. The second one is following a new couple, however, so you could read this as a standalone, in my opinion. The next one is a little bit more tough, I'd say, of a sell, and that's The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This is one of the best fantasy books I've ever written, period. But why I think this is, and the reason I'm smiling, is because this is an emotional gut punch of a story. The author is fabulous at making you care about these characters, and they go through some really tough stuff in this book. This is about a mom and her son as the two main characters, and the son is learning some truths about his society that, making him a little uncomfortable. Maybe he's been lied to his whole life. And then the mom used to be a warrior. She used to be well educated, and then she marries into this very conservative family and basically has to put everything away to become a wife and mother in a very traditional sense. And so we're following the two of them as like a threat from another nation is possibly looming between their two nations. This is a tough one because of the books on this list, this is probably the darkest in terms of the tone and themes, but I do think this is a great pickup for young adult readers because we are following a 14-year-old as a main character throughout here, but I would maybe put this later in your transition journey. Like, read Empire of Sand and the Daevabad trilogy first before dipping your toes into this one. I was also the young adult fantasy reader who didn't mind emotionally gut-punching fantasy stories. So if you're that type of fantasy reader for young adult, I think this would be a great transition book for you specifically. Then we have the Protectorate trilogy, the first book being Velocity Weapon by Megan E. O'Keefe. This is a sci-fi series on this list. This is great for young adult readers because it's fast-paced and action-packed, and it has a fun romantic subplot. I think the balance in here between the sci-fi plot and the romance plot is going to be really great for a young adult reader, but this also has a lot of humor in it. We are following a character who's basically trapped on a ship alone, and the ship is an AI system, and so she's working with the AI ship to get out of her predicament. And this is also following her brother, who's trying to also reconnect and find her since she's lost. And the ship is so funny and adds a layer of levity to the plot and the story and the characters, and I just think this one is a ton of fun. And it reads very, very quickly. I have to talk about Sanderson because, say what you want to say about Sanderson, I think he has some great transition books, and he was one of the first authors I got into when transitioning from young adults to adult, and I still think that holds true for a lot of readers. And the one Sanderson book I'm going to recommend in this video is Warbreaker. This is a standalone of Sanderson's, so hopefully not as intimidating as diving into the entire Cosmere and trying to get into Sanderson. This is primarily about two sisters, and one sister has been raised her whole life to be, she's the eldest daughter, she's been raised her whole life to be, you know, sold off as a political marriage, and you know, she's politically savvy, she's had all this education, but instead of her going off to marry the God King of a neighboring kingdom, her youngest sister is sent instead, who has had no preparation, no political education, and has been kind of a free spirit her whole life. And so we're following the two sisters, one who's going off and marrying the God King, and the other who's going after her in an attempt to save her. So this is a great standalone. The one thing I will say about Sanderson wholesale is his magic system and world building is fabulous, but he also writes really enjoyable characters as well. We're following younger characters. I believe the youngest sister is like 19 or 20, which I think could appeal to a young adult reader, but this also, I personally like the romance in this one. Sanderson is not really known for his romantic subplots or plots in his book, but I really like the romance in here. I love a good arranged marriage personally, and I think the plot and the magic system are really interesting in this one. And again, it feels kind of cozy and comforting for a young adult reader in that the tone is a little bit more maybe lighthearted, despite the stakes being high. That's important. So this is the Sanderson I recommend. I also think Tress of the Emerald Sea is a great choice, or Yumi and the Nightmare Painter are also great Sanderson standalones that would appeal, I think, greatly to young adult readers, even though they're adult books. The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. I'm laughing because I won't shut up about this trilogy, and this is the Winnowing Flame trilogy, and this I think would appeal to young adult readers because we're following primarily a cast of three. An archaeologist slash scholar who used to be a vintner named Vintage, and we have a witch, Noon, and kind of a vampire elf being named Tor, and the three of them team up to essentially go on an adventure, but obviously that's glossing over the larger plot happening in this world. And the reason I think this series is great for a young adult reader is because Noon is fairly young, and not just young, but naive about the world. She's been trapped and enslaved basically almost her whole life, and so she's escaping her enslavement and learning about the world kind of as a new person, and she's trying to find herself. So it's a little bit of like a coming of age, learning to grow in your power and in yourself as a person, and, you know, go on an adventure at the same time. So I think there's a lot in this series to enjoy as a young adult reader. A little bit of a coming of age moment with Noon, and some familiar tropes, but done in wacky and interesting ways, which is why I loved the Ninth Reign and the Winnowing Flame trilogy so much. Speaking of coming of age, we have Malice by John Gwynne. This is classic fantasy in the way that it is there's a prophecy and there's going to be a good guy and a bad guy that ultimately duke it out for the fate of the world. So it feels very classic and possibly familiar to young adult readers in that way. But this is also the first book in the series is a coming of age story for one of our main characters. And he starts out as a boy and he's being bullied and he's scared. And, you know, the future is so uncertain, but he gets to grow up, learn, train. He's trained to become a warrior and a leader in his own right. So that plot line specifically, I think, is really familiar for a lot of young adult readers. And again, I kind of miss coming of age stories as an adult. And so when I find really good coming of age stories in adult books, I just eat it right up. So I think Malice is excellent. I think The Faithful and the Fallen Quartet is wonderful and I love it to death, and I think more people should read it. And I think this is a perfect example of a transition book because there's young characters and more adults, more adulty adults, older adults as well. This also, not that everything is going to be fine, but it doesn't feel too dire, maybe. It's not quite grimdark in that way where you think everybody's gonna die and everything's gonna be terrible. There might be some casualties, but and you fear for them, but it's okay. It's alright. You can handle it. The last recommendation I have is another sci-fi standalone, and that's The Winter's Orbit by Everett Maxwell. This reads like a romance, which is why I highly recommend it. This is kind of an arranged marriage trope between Jinan and Kiem, and Jinan's previous partner died in mysterious ways, and Kiem steps in as the next husband to marry Jinan and hold this political marriage together, and this political alliance caused by the marriage together. And I love this so deeply, and I think this, again, in terms of the romance, has that angst and tension that I think a lot of young adult readers are going to enjoy, while still tackling more adult themes. Jinan is dealing with a lot of trauma and PTSD, and so this, the tone is maybe more adult, but I think the angst and tension in the romance is compelling for all readers, including young adult readers. And I think the murder mystery, or the potential murder mystery, at the heart of the story with the previous husband who passed away is also very compelling. Also, I think this, like the Protectorate series, the sci-fi elements aren't too hard to grasp. I think this one is very readable, as well as the Protectorate trilogy. Some of the other sci-fi on my shelf is a little inaccessible, I will say, and I don't feel that way about Winter's Orbit or the Protectorate trilogy. Here they are. Here are all of the books we talked about in this video, and this is incredibly heavy, and I need to sit down. So these are all the books I recommend for young adult readers trying to transition into adult fantasy and science fiction. What do you think? Have you read any of these books or series? I would love to know in the comments down below. Do you have any other recommendations for young adult readers, for adult recommendations? Also leave those down below as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video very soon. Bye!